Hello, my name is Rabbi Deborah Waxman, and I am the president of Reconstructing Judaism, the central organization of the Reconstructionist movement and of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, which trains amazing Reconstructionist rabbis. And I am so happy on behalf of my esteemed and beloved colleagues to welcome you all today to the second day of the Big Bold Jewish Climate Fest, and to this panel, to this conversation on rabbinical training and Jewish leadership in an era of climate crisis. At this moment, it is my great pleasure to invite my friends, my colleagues to introduce themselves.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rabbi Bradley Shavit Artson. I'm the Abner and Roslyn Goldstine Dean of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, which is located in Los Angeles and which trains conservative rabbis. I'm also vice president at American Jewish University, which is where the Ziegler School is located. And then finally, I am also the dean of the Zacharias Frankel College, which is a rabbinical program located at the University of Potsdam in Germany, training conservative and Masorti rabbis for Europe.
Hi, I'm Rabbi Dvora Weisberg. I am the Rabbi Aaron Pankin Professor of Rabbinics and the director of the Rabbinical School of Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. We train Reform rabbis, and we have 4 sites: Los Angeles, Cincinnati, New York, and Jerusalem.
And I'm Rabbi Nevins. I'm the Pearl Resnick Dean of the Rabbinical School at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I'm also the Dean of the Division of Religious Leadership, which includes our Cantorial School and our Center for Pastoral Education and other programs. And we train clergy for the conservative movement, but also we train clergy from other religions and other denominations of Judaism in pastoral care and in Jewish scholarship. And in terms of my own scholarship, I'm a member of our Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, writing responsa for the conservative movement with a focus on bioethics and technology and contemporary society.
Hi, it's really wonderful to be here. I'm Rabbi Sharon Cohen Anisfeld. I'm the president of Hebrew College in Newton, Massachusetts. We're a pluralistic institute for Jewish learning and leadership, and prepare Jewish leaders, rabbis, cantors, and educators, and also offer a wide array of community education programs for teens and adults and professionals. And I'll just say that I think we're all feeling grateful for this opportunity to be together and be in conversation with each other, something that it happens too rarely, and we look forward to it and look forward to doing it more often.
I feel very confident that it's going to be a really rich conversation, very full of substance and great learning. Where we thought we would begin for all of you was for us to reflect a little bit on our own perspectives about a relationship to nature, possibly also theology, how it is from our personal commitments we come to this conversation. We're going to move on into thinking about our institutional roles. We wanted to begin personally in reflection and in conversation with each other. So I'll begin. And where I want to start off with is I was a very bookish kid and remain kind of a pretty heady person. There's a story in my family that the summer I was 8, my parents laid down 2 rules. One was that I could only read 1 book a day, and that I had to go and walk around the block at least once. So I have to say, even as we camped every summer and spent the summers at the beach with my grandmother, I didn't rush to go outside. I wouldn't say that nature was my home, my place. Where I really came to, I would say, like an ecological sensibility really came through my deep engagement with religion, especially in rabbinical school. I mean, I had a lifelong practice of going to synagogue and an attachment to liturgy, and Shabbat was so important. But in rabbinical school, when I was applying to rabbinical school, a question that they asked me at RRC was, what's your experience of God? And I said, at first I said, oh, you're the Reconstructionist. I didn't expect you to ask me that question. And then I said, I experienced God in the faces of my family and my friends. And that immanent sense of the divine, and I later gained additional vocabulary and theological conceptualizations, especially inspired, I think, by Buber and Martin Buber, and an I thou sensibility, and that whole notion of mutuality and connection and interdependence, and reflecting on what is the unity in the Shema. All that, again and again, coming back to that sense of how we are ultimately all interconnected, really led me to understand that it was not only about relationship with humans, but indeed relationship with all creatures, all created, to the cellular level. And so coming from that place, expanding ever outwards, is where I really began to orient toward this understanding of how each and every action that we take as agents in the world have ramifications and responsibilities, locally on the most minute level and on the most global level. And with that growing realization came a greater orientation to nature, to the world around me, both in seeing and experiencing and appreciating.
That's wonderful, Deborah. Can I ask you a follow-up question to that? So how has that morphed in your adult life? So this inside bookish girl, you are Jacob, pure in your tense. Has that changed at all? Or are you still someone whose love of the larger natural world is from the comfort of inside, appreciating that the walls are actually not real, that it's actually all one?
I so appreciate that question. You know, when I talk about my bookishness, I often talk about how I'm so grateful that I thought in my 20s, when I was choosing between rabbinical school, I thought I was choosing between rabbinical school and the academic. And in the end, I was just sequencing the rabbinical school before the PhD. And I talk about how grateful I am that I went to rabbinical school because it cracked open my heart. And then I talk now about that my work is so much about also integrating somatics in with head and heart and body. And I think as part of that commitment and as part of this awakening that I was just describing, I try to be outside much more. I try to go outside every single day. That has felt pre-pandemic, I traveled a great deal, and I tried to make certain that I would get into the natural world. In the pandemic, this is my world, and I try to get outside and to be near water and to listen to the birds. So I do think that even though the tent is my most comfortable place, I know that I am at once bigger and smaller when I get myself outside.
That's beautiful. I'd like to shift and tell it as a personal thing. It turns out I just realized while we were talking that I've spent my entire life stalking Dvora Weisberg. So I grew up a couple blocks away from her, and then I moved to New York to study at JTS where she already was. And then I came up to LA where she already was. I've apparently been just following her. It's very creepy. I'm pleased you don't just walk out of the room when you see me. But San Francisco is a place where nature isn't out there. And I'll tell you two stories about that. The first is that when I was a kid, I was very interested in science and I wanted to be a biologist. And I have a very generous dad who talked to some scientists at Script Landing, and they got 2 little octopi. And we set up a saltwater tank in my basement. One of them did not make the trip home, but one of them lived for almost a year, which for an octopus is pretty good. His name was Ichabod Clancy. And I had an I thou with Ichabod Clancy. Literally, he knew me. And if you know octopi, they turn colors and they gain texture based on their emotions. So you know if an octopus likes you or doesn't. And he would come out of his lair and he would turn all bubbly brown, which was happy to see you, Brad. And if I came in with a friend, he would suddenly turn either white and smooth, which is I'm terrified with this person, who is that? Or he would get bumpy red, which is get that person out of here now. So I never grew up with a boundary between me and the rest of nature. And I want to clarify that. I don't think it's nature versus human. There's only nature. And we humans have the arrogant supposition that we're outside it or an exception to it, but we're not. Second example of that, I was in high school, still wanting to be a biologist, and I took out some college textbooks on animal behavior. And all of them spoke about how we project human emotionality onto animals. And I remember thinking, this PhD scholar has never lived with a dog or a cat. Because if you did, you would know that that's completely ridiculous if you think you have a monopoly on these feelings. We had a long-haired dog and she would get burrs in her hair, and we would take her to the vet and they would give her a buzz cut over her whole body. And then she would run inside and run under my mother's bed and stay there for a week and a half for exactly the same reasons you would if someone gave you an unwanted buzz cut. And now science has moved. Science says, well, where do you think you got those feelings from? So my work in Jewish thought has always been about integrating science and religion and understanding that at a deeper level, they are not in conflict, that there can be, unless you're a Jewish fundamentalist or a scientific fundamentalist, that in fact, the modes of self-correction and inquiry are very much parallel, and both lead to a sense of awe and marvel and wonder, which then get embodied in Jewish practice. Last thought I just share. There's one of my favorite Mishnahs. It's very problematic. It's in Pirkei Avot, the teachings of the sages. The rabbi says that if you are studying Torah and you break off your study to say, how beautiful is this tree, you lose your place in the world to come. And there's an 18th century commentary to it that says the problem is not in appreciating the tree. The problem is thinking that that's breaking away from your Torah study. And that if your Torah study is continuous and includes what a wonderful tree, then you're good.
Wow. I'll say that no one has ever said that they'd stalked me before today, so I don't know if I should be nervous or not. As Brad has already told you, I grew up in San Francisco, a few miles from him. And I've actually lived most of my life in cities, but even in cities, I was exposed to nature. I woke up every morning when I was living at home with the privilege of looking straight out to the ocean. And what really still strikes me to this day is an awareness of the vastness of the ocean when I would look out at it, and the vastness of the sky when we would go camping or when I was at camp, just the sense of this expanse of starry sky and how small I felt and how comfortable I felt feeling small, which always makes me think of the verse, right? Marabu ma'asecha Adonai, right? How great are your works, O God, that surround us. And then I didn't have an octopus, which I think that would have been where my parents would have drawn the line, but had a parade over my childhood of animals, starting with the goldfish from the Purim Carnival and moving up to the turtles and then to the cats and the dogs. And we had a very shy cat. And I remember sitting in front of the refrigerator. The cat used to hide behind the refrigerator for an hour at a time, hoping that if I was quiet enough and non-threatening enough, that the cat would come out and the cat and I would develop a relationship. The cat rarely came out, but when it did, I was the person that it felt safe with. And then I also began to garden and to get my hands dirty. And I went to a summer camp that was a working ranch and fed animals and took care of animals and, weeded out the tomato patch. So I've always had a nice relationship with nature, although I, like Deborah, lived in my head an awful lot. And one of the things I was so happy about when I came back to California was the vastness, again, of the various ecosystems, of really looking around and realizing how powerful the world is and how beautiful it is. And my theology, in part, is about recognizing that all of creation reflects the Creator, and that we live in an interconnected system where each of us is simply a part of a magnificent whole. And so that's what I bring to this discussion.
Maybe I'll pick up there when Dvora was saying at the end about a spiritual sense of interconnectedness, which we've heard also Brad was speaking about. There isn't nature, everything is nature. I think that my spiritual life really began before I studied Judaism. When as a child, I explored the mountains of the Northeast of the United States, especially the Adirondack Mountains, an area that I spent all my summers as a kid. And I now continue to go to summers, falls, and also in the winter. Just a few weeks ago, hiking in the snow in upstate New York, the silence of the woods as the snow fell, and then hearing the sound of the frozen creek beneath the ice. These are some of the most numinous moments. And even as a child, I began to hear about threats to the beauty that I was witnessing in the phenomenon of acid rain, where the industrial Midwestern plants, coal plants, were sending clouds of pollution that were arriving and precipitating on my beloved Adirondacks. And I was being taught already from an early age that the lakes and the streams were in danger of becoming sterile, of becoming dead. And it was so against the ethics that we were being taught of leaving no trace behind. And so I guess my first spirituality was very much about the lessons of being in the world and responsible for the world. And then as I began to open my mind towards Jewish learning, this idea of kol koreh b'midbar that you find in Isaiah 40, that the voice is heard in the wilderness, was very responsive to me. And I started to look in the Bible for nature, and I found mountains everywhere. And specifically mountains. If you think about it, the Torah has many people climbing mountains. Abraham climbs mountains, and Moses, even at the very end of his life at 120, is still climbing up and down the mountains. I think he's arguing with God. God says, you have to go down the mountain, then you can come back up. What does it mean to say to a 120-year-old man, by the way, just go down the mountain one more time and then just climb back up? But there's something about the exhaustion of taking a step and climbing higher and feeling that as one physically ascends, one also gains broader spiritual perspective. That is something that really connected for me, my Jewish learning and my love of nature, my love of the woods and the wild places. And although I'm a very bookish person too, for me, actually, nature and love of it came first.
Mm. Oh, there's so many threads I want to pick up on here, but maybe I'll just focus on two that are really emerging strongly for me. So the first is this theme of interconnectedness, which I just feel like each of us have touched on in different ways. And Bradley, I couldn't agree more. Even the question, sort of what is our relationship to nature, already articulates itself in a way that is sort of contradicted by everything we're saying, that there isn't something out there called nature that we have a relationship to, but nature includes us. It includes the air we breathe in and out. It includes water that is outside of us and the water that is inside of us. It includes the ground we walk on, whether it's pristine or paved. Really, it's all part of nature, and we are part of it. We're all going back to some early memories. The one that came to my mind first was sort of my first memory of thinking explicitly about God, my sort of first explicit theological memory, which, believe it or not, was from Mrs. Malowitz's Hebrew school class. I think it was first grade, and she had taken the class outside, and I have a very vivid, kind of palpable memory of sitting outside having this discussion under a tree, and I was scandalized to hear one of my classmates, Danny Troop, maybe you're listening, wherever you are, Danny. Danny said he didn't believe in God. And I was really scandalized. I don't know, I was 7 or 8, but because I had this very, very strong feeling of God essentially as a presence at the heart of existence that connects all of us, and a presence in me and in Danny Troop and in the tree that we were sitting under and in the grass that we were sitting on. And so I think what scandalized me was trying to imagine what would it feel like to live with a sense of absence at the heart of existence as opposed to a sense of presence at the heart of existence. So that's one memory that comes to mind, because it was such a, just in terms of this conversation, such an early memory of that, a presence that connects, and that understanding of God is one that was with me at a young age and has gone through, has evolved and taken on different language. But I think it's really fundamentally, it feels very connected to what you were saying, Deborah, in particular, but it's fundamentally, I think, my experience of the divine. The other thing that I wanted to pick up, and connects us all, all life. So no boundary there between human life and the rest of life in terms of our relationship to that presence that connects. The other thing I wanted to pick up on, just as you were talking, Dvora, about the sense of humility and awe in the presence of the vastness of nature, is just another really important memory for me, important experience, was from a time that I was living in Israel, and I was on a Shabbat afternoon in a Torah study session, and the teacher was teaching about the importance of having a sense of katnut, having a sense of smallness in order to receive blessing, in order to receive bracha, that we need to be able to cultivate a sense of smallness in order to receive blessing. And as I was listening to this wonderful teacher teach, I started to cry, and I was listening to him, and I was feeling, I think I feel the opposite, that so often having a sense of smallness gets in the way of my feeling of receiving bracha. And I admit, a part of me was thinking, maybe you need to work on your sense of smallness. But for me, I think I that's not helpful. Anyway, the next morning, I was with a group, and we happened to be going down to the Negev for several days of camping and hiking in the desert. And I just remember early the following morning going onto a hilltop to daven, sort of facing the desert, and having this moment of, oh, this kind of smallness, not the smallness in relation to other human beings where we're comparing ourselves and feeling small, but the kind of smallness where we're all standing before the vastness of the desert, of the divine, and radically equalizing sense of smallness in the face of that vastness. So I just really wanted to appreciate you picking, lifting up sort of that sense, Dvora, of the way also our relationship to the vastness of the natural world is so deeply connected to our sense of humility and partialness and part ofness that we feel in relation to the divine. So let me pause there. I don't know if anybody wants to pick up on any, ask any questions, or we can move. We wanted to I guess we wanted to move into talking more explicitly about our work as leaders of institutions that are preparing people for religious leadership. And I guess the way that I wanted to frame that sort of cluster of questions for us is that in some ways I think a central religious question is, what does it mean to live responsibly in relationship with that presence that connects? I mean, if we all are talking about that deep and radical sense of interconnectedness of all things, what are we saying about what it means to live responsibly in relation to that? And what does it mean to prepare leaders who are helping all of us cultivate a sense of both awareness of that and responsible living in relationship to it? And of course, those questions are sort of brought into relief, sharpened, made more urgent as that sense of interconnectedness is in some ways so violated and endangered by the way that we're living and the climate crisis that we find ourselves facing, very much of our own making.
I so appreciate how you framed it, Sharon, and I do think that commonality, that no surprise that we all we come to a place of awe, and I think and deep humility as we're talking about that. And I think for me, with that recognition of mutuality and interconnection, then comes obligation. And so, I mean, my background is that I grew up in the conservative movement, and now I find myself in the Reconstructionist movement. And we understand ourselves to be deeply in relationship to halakha and not bound to halakha. And an abiding preoccupation I have as a rabbi and as the leader of the movement and conversations at all time is, how do we, if halakha is not binding, then how do we cultivate a sense of obligation and a sense of responsibility so that people voluntarily submerge their individual interests in the service of something larger, whether it's minyan and community, or it's in the service of this imperative of saving an endangered planet. And so that, for me, it is always about drawing deeply from the wisdom of our ancestors, whether it's the images or the practices or the sense of articulating what responsible behavior looks like. So it's constant engagement and it's constant discussion through the prism of our classes and our community building around the classes and in the co-curriculum and in internships and in both drawing on the skills and the content that we're teaching, but at all times trying to raise up precisely the questions that you ask, because each of our students are going to answer it differently. We're not looking to train cookie cutter rabbis. We want to develop the most authentic. I'm sure this is true across our institutions. We want to help them to find the most authentic sense of selves. At the same time, we're trying to both orient them toward the past and toward the wisdom of our ancestors, and orient them toward the present and the future. This is a pressing issue. Give it your attention. Bring whatever it is you have to bring to move the needle, to tell the story, to join in coalition and solidarity to make a difference.
I would say that one of the things we're always asking ourselves is, what are the tools that our students need to fulfill the vision that they bring to rabbinical school, or the vision, which often changes, obviously, with which they leave rabbinical school and enter the rabbinate. So I think that that this issue, like many other pressing issues, calls on us to think about both how are we bringing to our students the ability to study, to transmit, to transform the textual tradition that Judaism has, which has something to say about stewardship of the planet, of our responsibility to all of the world and not just to ourselves and our own desires. And then, of course, the tools that we teach them in order to translate that into action and into leadership. So what are we teaching them about community organizing? Because you can't save the planet by yourself, right? You could have the best vision in the world, and unless you can convince people to join you and convince people with power to act, it doesn't do any good. How do you persuade people? How do you speak in a compelling way? How do you care for people who are suffering the consequences of the poor decisions that human beings have made? So all of those things that we teach, even when they're not specifically about the climate crisis, are things that we can bring to bear, our students can bring to bear, our alumni do bring to bear upon the issues that most speak to us and should be keeping us all awake right now.
Dvora, I find that so powerful. I want to respond to something everyone has said and then build on what Dvora just said. In speaking about humility, a very important virtue, one of my favorite thinkers, Walter Kaufmann, came up with the phrase humbition, which is the combination of humility and ambition together, because you don't want your smallness at the expense of others, and there are others who are willing to impose that kind of smallness, and that's not good. But a sense of oneness that becomes manifest in I am part of something, and that's part of what gives me meaning, that none of us are defined separate from the world. We are integrated with the world, and we are the totality of all of our relationing, all of our relationships, and that's really how we keep changing and growing and becoming. I'd like to emphasize the notion of landedness, that, the Bible tells a powerful double story, that Adam, the earthling, comes out of the earth. And it never specifies where that earth is. In fact, there's a wonderful rabbinic story that says that parts of Adam were made from the earth of all over the globe, so that there's nowhere where we're not all at home. And that feels so powerful, to see the whole beautiful planet as our home has got to be a piece of the solution. But then the Torah goes beyond that and gives us an additional landedness. We learn to love all of it by a special relationship with a part of it. So that in Jewish tradition, our veneration of and attention to the land of Israel and how we live in it and how we cultivate it and how we allow it to rest, all of that Judaizes it, not for the sake of separating the land of Israel from the earth as a whole, but how else can you learn to love if you don't love the individual and love the specific and love the concrete? And then the second thing I want to talk about is the challenge of sanctification. And here I think Judaism actually has practical wisdom that can apply to the issue of climate change, that we're not behaving in a way to put things in the bank so that later we have a reward somewhere else. We are working very hard to manifest the thriving of all things in the here and now. Maimonides, great medieval environmental thinker, talked about how Olam Haba, the world to come, we think of as chronologically after death. But in reality, that's a mistake, he says, because if it's eternity, it's as much now as it is anywhere else. So that it's a mindset, it's a consciousness. And if we can cultivate a consciousness that our religious discipline includes how do we walk responsibly on the earth. Dvora spoke about stewardship. And that's a key concept out of Bereshit and out of Devarim as well, that we are to be stewards of this, of which we are a part. And that has to be a measure of Jewish seriousness, no less than lighting Shabbat candles or other Sabbath observance or other valid ways. As a conservative rabbi, we haven't given up on halacha as an authoritative system yet, at least not officially. And so we continue to struggle with its limitations and emphasize its dynamism and insist that it's the lack of creativity within it that makes it look rigid and brittle. But for me, then, I want to say that it's no less a mitzvah, a commandment of the divine, a matter. If God is that which invites us to thrive best in the world, then making sure that the world around us is suitable to human thriving, which is really of all thriving, of all interrelationship, then that too becomes part of our Shulchan Aruch, our guide to Jewish religious practice.
So if I can build on what you said, Brad, specifically the part about landedness, maybe some of the other parts too, I quite agree, of course, but it's also about a sense of a limitation of title. We don't own the land, and as the Torah says so beautifully, "V'ha'aretz lo timaker letzmitud," don't think you can just sell the land like a property forever. Higerim v'toshavim atem imadi, because you're actually like tenant farmers. You're temporary on this earth. And so there is a sense that although we like to think of ourselves as heirs, inheritors of the earth, the truth is that we're only here very temporarily. And that sense of limitation on ownership should also cause us to limit our appetites. And to me, what halakha is really about is it's practical theology. It's living with a sense of God guiding you in the world, which includes having a sense that God is the borei, the creator, and that we are nivra, we are creations, and we don't actually create the world. We can think of ourselves as co-creators in a temporary sense, but actually we are part of the creation. And so we have an obligation to limit our appetites. And so if I could transition to the students, I think actually the students perhaps are having a clearer sense of limitation than some of us are, because I think they've grown up, like our sense of environmentalism growing up in the 70s and whatever, the 60s, 70s, 80s, was more about pollution than about the climate crisis. Some of the early prayers I wrote about the environment were very much about how we've polluted the planet. And that's true. But I think what's going on now is a sense that we are cooking the planet in a way that is causing damage, which is not only about pollution, but about the entire temperature and the sustainability of life. And I think a lot of our students are actually leading the way. Many of them, our students are climate activists, and they were that before they came to rabbinical school, and then are expanding that as rabbinical students. Many of them are fellows with Dayenu and with other environmental organizations and teaching at this very conference. And we're very proud of them. But I think sometimes they're also challenging us. How could you serve this food which is not sustainably produced, for example? Why should we fly to Israel and to live on the other side of the planet when localism is so much part of the ethics of environmentalism today, that we need to improve the area around us and not pollute further by moving? So the challenge of how we consume, the challenge of how we move, the challenge of how we live, can we lighten our step upon the earth? I think that these are very much native to traditional thoughts in halakha, which are trying to teach us to control our appetites, to not feel that we can eat anything and do anything, but that we need to limit ourselves a little bit for the sake of surviving and expanding our consciousness to connect to our Creator.
Danny, I'm so glad you said, I'm glad you said all of what you said, but I want to zero in on what you said about our students, many of our students leading the way. Because this is, for me, I can't think about this question of sort of what are our responsibilities as leaders of institutions preparing religious leaders, without thinking about the fact that in many, many significant ways, a significant portion of our students know more about climate change than I do, have been actively engaged in working on the issues for, longer, well, maybe not longer than I have, but more actively than I have. And not just me, but, we have so much to learn from their experience in this area and from their sense of urgency. Deborah, when you said, how do you cultivate a sense of obligation without it being grounded in halakha? I'm like, they have such a clear sense of obligation around it, and it's for some may be grounded in halakha, and for some it's grounded in the relational imperative of living in this world that we live in, and so that doesn't feel like the hard part in terms of sort of what we can offer and have a responsibility to help cultivate in my own experience. So I guess, part of what I struggle with in this regard is, or think about a lot in this regard is, on the one hand, how do we really, in a very serious way, partner with our students in thinking together about what it means to respond to this moment as Jews, as religious leaders, as human beings, to respond responsibly. And then the other thing that I think about a lot is, what might we have to offer, not so much in terms of what they need to know in this area, but sort of in terms of the midot around leadership, around pastoral work, around these other dimensions of the rabbinate, which are actually, very challenging to reckon with in a time of so much upheaval. And one of my former students, now colleagues, Rabbi Shoshana Friedman, when we were talking about this, she's also very involved in the Big Bold Climate Fest, and she talks about this a lot in terms of not just narrowly climate change, of course, but really, what does it mean to be going into spiritual leadership, religious leadership in a time of such profound upheaval and it's all interconnected upheaval. So I think about what we might have to offer also in terms of midot, like this has to do, I guess, with ambition. Balancing how do you work with and cultivate a sense of agency in the face of so much uncertainty? And, for me, a core touchstone text is the words of Mordechai to Esther in the Megillah, Mi yodea im le'et kazot higat lamachut. And, for me, that Mi yodea.
Sharon, translate.
Yes. Who knows if it wasn't for just this moment that you achieved this position, that you became queen. And part of what's so important to me about that line is the mi yodea, the who knows, that not this is exactly why you are where you are and what you need to do, but in the face of uncertainty, in the face of fear, just consider the possibility that there's a reason why you are where you are now, and that you have something particular to bring to the situation, to do in this situation that can be redemptive, So I think about that as one area where helping our students step into leadership with that kind of blend of a sense of agency and the capacity to live with uncertainty.
I would add in also that like the capacity to persuade, because I think that you talked about your students, and we have them as well, they have the sense of obligation, they have the clarity, and it is compelling to me. And we think about that the modality in democracy is one of persuasion, and we see how broken communication is, and how fractured the larger society is. Like how to step into, whether it's the prophetic role, whether it's the priestly role, whether it's the pastoral, however it is, that they can take that sense that is so clear to themselves and enact it not just in the service of activism, but also in the service of widening that circle so that it is a shared sensibility. That seems, all of that seems very alive to me as well.
Deborah, I would just add to that, it's so crucial. I'm aware that we are 5 white Jews talking about our relationship to the earth. And one of the things my students have helped me to see, and they really brought this to my attention, they were the first ones that talked to me about food deserts in Los Angeles. I didn't know there could be such a thing, but it's become painfully obvious that there are issues of racial injustice involved in environmental issues and in climate change. And there are issues of economic imbalance and injustice, the ways that this climate change stuff is going to hit the poorest and the most marginalized, and frankly, in many communities already has been devastating cancer rates in minority communities that are put near factories that pollute. And so I think recognizing, to go back to what all of us have touched on, which is the interconnectedness of it all, these are not actually discrete and separate issues. These are all interconnected issues. And part of our ambition, which I love the fact that it's coming from all of us. I tell people all the time that I don't have a vision for the Ziegler School, because if I did, it would be imposing it on the students. So my job is to create a tzimtzum, a space where we together can constantly craft an ongoing vision, because the students and what they've brought to the school, some of them have gone on to be Jewish farmers, some of them have gone on to work in food justice issues. All of them come, as do your students, with a strong, strong commitment to fixing the mess that they inherited, and to doing it differently and better, that it's a new beginning, which feels to me so fundamentally Jewishly loyal, that every moment is Mechadesh Betuvo Maaseh Bereshit, that every moment is renewing creation. So this is the end of a moment and the beginning of a moment, and how we begin, that's up to us. And we have much to learn from our students, but then our job is to give them the tools to be able to make that work in the broader community and to institutionalize it successfully. And that, I think, we can in our institutions help to accomplish for them.
I think another thing that we can be helpful with, I mean, it's true that sometimes our students are in fact our teachers, which is actually one of the great blessings of doing the work we do, right? But I think that, and this came up, when we were talking before as we were planning this session, is that I think we all know that when we were young and had these passionate causes, how hard it was sometimes to see the injustice in the world, to fight back against what we were experiencing. I mean, I know certainly as a young woman in the 70s and 80s at JTS, which was not particularly friendly to young women in that time, that you can really sometimes lose hope. And I know that we've talked about that. And one of the things that really strikes me is our students need our support to continue to believe sometimes. And I'm thinking of a text that I've taught many times, that the questions you'll be asked at the end of time, at the end of judgment, in the tractate of Shabbat, in the Talmud. And one of them is, Tzipita Yeshua, loosely translated, did you anticipate or did you look forward to what I guess we could call salvation? And as I try to explain that to people, the words suddenly become very foreign. It doesn't sound very Jewish. But I've said to people, this means, did you have faith that things could be better? Did you have faith? And I know right now when we confront the climate crisis, it seems overwhelming and just, we're going to destroy the world. And I think at this moment, the notion of hope and the notion that even if we can't know that the things we're trying will succeed, even if it might be that we could in the end fail, that we have to live out our values. We have to live our best hopes, because that's what each of us is called on by God to do, is to do the best we can to have faith in the future.
Dvora, you beautifully transitioned us into what we wanted to be the final part of our conversation, and we have just a little bit more than 10 minutes to go. So thank you so much for we wanted to think about what about the future? What are the obligations? What are the opportunities? What are the orientations? I want to open it up to.
Well, I'd like to quote our friend, Rabbi Jennie Rosenn, who founded this wonderful new organization, Dayenu, but before that had worked for HIAS with refugee issues. And as she said in a recent article, the two issues are really linked. And this is going back to what Brad was saying about the justice implications of the environmental or the climate crisis, because as climate change is causing the interiors of continents to dry out and the coastlines to be flooded, there's going to be massive numbers of refugees. We already have massive numbers, 60 million refugees in the world. And if that gets doubled or tripled, and if diseases continue to grow and are moved, as all the people move and more diseases spread more quickly, there's no hiding from this crisis. And so that can tend to lead to a sense of despair. And I think one of the things that we need to learn from Judaism and from our Jewish history is the importance of maintaining hope, but not just an empty hope, lu yehi, if only it could be, but to have a sense of responsibility. And, when I read about the climate crisis, I think about mitigation, which is trying to slow down the rise in temperature, about adjustment, and so that we can prepare and harden our societies for the change, and then anything that we can do to ameliorate the situation. These are not just general human values, but they're actually Jewish obligations. And I don't really set them apart, that there's like ritual law and then there's sort of environmental law. It's all connected to the idea that we're not owners of the earth, that we have to release and loosen our grip on the world and stop thinking that it's ours to do with as we will, but rather that we have to be protectors of this glorious place which God has given, not to us, but to all that lives.
I host a podcast called Dayenu, Jewish Teachings on Resilience. And so I've come to this belief that resilience is hardwired into the Jewish civilization. And it's one of the reasons why we, the Jewish people, and the Jewish civilization has continued throughout millennia. And frequently, most of the time I'm talking about psychological resilience and the notion of catastrophe, that we've again and again encountered catastrophe where we question what our relationship to the divine and what our relationship to each other and to the wider world is, and that we have found ways to recreate and to reseed. Resilience also has an environmental sensibility as well, and it feels to me like I never want to be Pollyanna-ish about it, but I think about like those. I was visiting a congregation last December and spoke to someone he's working on developing a kind of seaweed that if fed to cows could reduce methane in the environment by 80%, which would be such a radical amelioration. So I just feel like we must act. It's not simply an orientation of like, as you said, lu yehi, like, oh, it'll be okay, but at the same time, there's so much we don't know. There's that humility again. There's so much we don't know. Exert ourselves as much as possible to try to bring about these outcomes that we can't even imagine at this moment in time.
I want to just jump in on this question of hope, because it just feels so central to everything that we're doing and to what it means to be responding, again, as human beings and as leaders and as Jews to the crisis that we're in. It's really, so first of all, on the, I feel like there's a conversation that goes on in sort of environmental circles, which is, how honest should we be about how completely desperate the situation is? Because if we're really totally honest, then people will be paralyzed, won't be able to act. And so we have to kind of temper it. And then other people feel like, no, we have to be brutally honest, because that's the only way we're going to shock people into acting. And, so I feel that part of my struggle with that way of setting up the conversation is that I don't think, and I live with an environmental scientist, so I have some backup here, there is a not knowing. We don't know exactly how all of this is going to play out and what impact our actions could have for the good, along with the impact for the bad. But I think that for our students, for us in sort of rabbinic religious leadership roles, there's another issue underneath that, for me at least, and this is something that it feels important to me to be in honest conversation with our students about, and with the young people in my life, other young people in my life, which is that I know that I personally sometimes find myself getting angry actually at the acute despair, like the really, it's just all over, there's no hope. And I realize in myself that brings up anger. And then when I go a little bit deeper beneath the anger, what I find is grief, and so the reason I'm saying that is just because I think the only way through that morass of despair, anger, grief, and back out to hope on the other side is to sort of have the spaciousness with each other to have those honest conversations. And this is where, persuasion, yes, but sometimes also to create spaces where we're not trying to persuade each other, and we're just trying to accompany each other through this, what is really quite a terrifying reality that we're facing. And so the hope feels so critical. I agree with all of you. And I also feel like there's always this, it's like not rushing to hope. When hope feels rushed, it can really create pushback. And so, I feel like non-rushed hope, and maybe hope in the form of questions, like back to that, just consider the possibility that what we're doing now could make a difference. And so anyway.
That's so crucial, to be able to not weaponize hope, which it can be. I'd like to talk about something also that can be weaponized and is equally problematic. It hasn't been brought up today, and that is the role of science, which can be weaponized because there are people who are very happy to say, oh, they'll come up with a fix. We'll come up with the magic pellets for the burping cows, and then the problem will go away, so I can continue to live my life without changing anything. And I guess what I want to do is avoid the dichotomy of either science is the hero swooping in to save us and we're passive, or God is the hero swooping in to save us and we're passive. We're all connected and they're all tools, but I want to highlight that I think especially for those Jews who don't believe that everything in our tradition is literally the word of God, we have a particular obligation to maintain scientific literacy. And I know that all of our rabbinical schools are overburdened by what we have to teach our students in a very short period of time. So I'm not suggesting we take a year off to gun them up, but I do tell my students, I teach a course in religion and science. I do tell them they should be subscribing to 1 or 2 science magazines, and they should be reading it every month, because particularly those of us who believe that the Torah is an incredible repository of human wisdom, but not the embodiment of every truth about the universe, we do need to arm ourselves. And that then opens us to see science as an ally in this, in the ways of coming up with better food for cows or better approaches, plus a spiritual discipline of, okay, I'm going to use less plastics, I'm going to leave my car aside, that kind of approach.
Last words before we move toward closing. Anyone have a last thing that they want to contribute?
Well, I'll just offer, as we pause, this conversation is ongoing, but as we pause, I'll offer the in relation to this question of hope, the words that are just reverberating in my own mind and heart through this whole conversation. And those are the words that we heard so beautifully from our poet laureate, from Amanda Gorman last week at the inauguration. These words that she read or really breathed and danced for us. This is from the end of her poem at the inauguration. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it.
So beautiful. So wonderful, all of you. Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody who's listening.
Yeah.
Happy Tu B'Shvat.
Thank you, everybody.
And
Thank you.
it's
Very,
climate
very
great.
great to be together.
Wonderful.